Welcome to Angels and Seer Stones. I'm Chris.
And I'm Christine.
Today we're talking about legends on the secret combinations of Wayward Missionaries. You might have heard of these groups. Sometimes they're called the Quorum of the 12 Apostates, the Gadianton Robbers, the Maui Swim Team, or other local variants like the Brotherhood, I was recently told, is a legendary group in South Africa.
If you've served a full-time mission, you're probably eager to share your own stories. And if you have no frame of reference for these type of legends, I assure you, you are an anomaly. Either way, we hope you enjoy today's episode.
Latter-day Saints are a people of radical faith. We are a unique body of Bible-believing Christians. For us, the scriptural canon has been opened. The traditional sacraments have expanded. Our beliefs and practices are steeped in universalism, esotericism, and apocalypticism.
The Latter-day Saint tradition is a religion in which angels visit everyday people, and sometimes men and women see the divine in stones. In this podcast, we examine the lived religion of Latter-day Saints, the stories we tell, and the beliefs we debate.
We take seriously the whole gambit of Latter-day Saint experience. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Angels and Seer Stones.
For the past few days, we've had quite a few RMs share with us stories from their own missions about young men who were dishonorably released from their service. The stories have focused both on individuals as well as whole districts, sometimes even missionaries returning home excommunicated from the church. The reasons have ranged from wild antics to impregnating local girls to conversion to Mormon offshoots.
And while some of the less obscene stories seem to check out, the fantastical narratives always seem to come by way of a senior companion whose trainer knew another missionary who told them about some early moment when this secret combination really flourished. You get the idea. These are friends of a friend legends. Folklorist William A. Wilson points to at least two ways in which these legends might function. The first is that they provide missionaries with a release. These are trickster narratives in which wayward missionaries, in Wilson's words, are not models for conduct, but rather projections of desire generally thwarted by society. His prime example for this is the legend cycle of the unauthorized trip. Remember, missionaries are assigned to geographic boundaries and they're expected to stay there. Well, in the unauthorized trip, missionaries leave that boundary and leave that most basic of mission rules.
In my office, I have hundreds of these archival variants. Let's go ahead and share one now.
It happened in Okinawa several years before I went there. Back then, it was where all the rotten missionaries were sent. It was the closest thing to hell on earth. It was so hot. The mission president was a long way away. Now it's different. The elders meet regularly with the mission president. Anyway, there were 8 elders there and they wanted to see Hong Kong. Of course, it was out of the mission. It took 2 weeks to get there by boat. But these elders figured out a plan of how to do it. They wrote up their weekly reports in advance, dated them, and gave them to their landlord to mail separately on the dates indicated. He misunderstood and sent them all in together. The mission president found out, and he was there to meet them when they all came back.
Legends about missionary sexual antics, which we'll share momentarily, may also be a sort of release. Not that your average missionary would ever engage in that sort of behavior, but missionaries are young people who are abstaining from dating altogether, eager to get home and get married. Did any of you RMs out there ever hand hug on your mission? This is a bit ridiculous, but it's when an elder and a sister would place their palms against one another and use their thumbs to embrace. And on a mission, even that seemed a bit deviant.
What I remember is elders and sisters taking photographs, and the sisters would hold their arms in a certain way behind their back in between the elders, so it looks like he has his arm wrapped around both of them. I think it makes sense that young men and young women are telling these stories at this time as projections of desire. But also, Wilson's other explanation for these stories makes a lot of sense to me. He viewed them as a warning for missionaries to conform to mission rules.
That's true, but also why the missionaries sharing these view the protagonists as certainly naughty. It still acts as a coping mechanism for dealing with the emotions that are there clearly bubbling on the surface.
I think it's important to keep both of these functions in mind, both the idea that they can be warnings and the idea that they might be projections of desire, coping mechanisms, as we look at a few more stories.
And we see this in the endless legends on elders dating or impregnating young women. The one I heard in the MTC, and this was probably about a week in, was about an elder who excused himself to use the bathroom while eating dinner at the bishop's home. While walking down the hall, he accidentally bumps into the bishop's daughter, who has just exited the bathroom in a towel. One thing leads to another, and next thing you know, she's pregnant. But there are others about more intentional dating, and I would guess many of our listeners are familiar with at least one of these stories.
Folklorist Alyssa R. Hinken argues that legends escalate in danger and obscenity as they take shape among the public and as they move from one generation to the next. The following legend documents transgressions that are not only immoral, but sacrilegious.
I was called to the Tempe, Arizona mission, and, when I got there, it quickly changed to the Gilbert, Arizona mission. I remember there being missionaries that had been there a little bit longer than me, and I remember them telling me, "Do you know about the 12 apostate missionaries that served here years ago?" And this was some terrible stuff. They would break mission rules, sleep around with girls. What's sad is some elders said that one guy had sex in the baptismal font. How terrible is that? Yeah, they were called the 12 apostate missionaries of Tempe, and somehow they were found out. They were all sent home and excommunicated immediately.
That last story is probably one of the more famous of missionary legend cycles. I'm not referring specifically to the steamy baptismal event. Ew! But to the overarching narrative, the legend of a secret missionary alliance established among a select few. Although this weekend when a friend shared a story from his own mission, it was a select 65.
I've definitely never heard such a large number. Usually that quorum of 12 apostates is taken pretty literally. There's 12, or perhaps a few more, but 65 is unheard of. But it certainly tells us how a legend can escalate. Missionary secret societies are a retelling of what the Book of Mormon calls secret combinations. Of course, that's another word for conspiracies. Especially their retellings of the Gadianton robber narrative from the Book of Helaman. This is a group that's organized around a secret oath to profit from evil deeds. They could detect each other through performing special signals that only they knew. And here's one story that better highlights that sense of secrecy.
My friend served his mission in Mexico, and this all happened there. There was this group of missionaries, a cult type thing, inside of the mission, and they had a hazing ritual to join it. A missionary would have to know a secret combination handshake, a secret combination hand sign, and then they even had signs or marks on their garments, or created their own garments to wear under or something, I'm not sure. There were a bunch of things you had to do to join the group, but the last thing you had to do was go to your house and take a picture in front of your house. So the secretaries actually ended up in on it and would actually book flights for the missionaries to fly to their houses and take the photo. But you couldn't get caught in the airport or by the president or by anybody. They had to be super secretive. And most of the time, the companion did it with them. There was a member of the 70 who came and either saw the writing or stickers that the missionaries had on the back of their plaques, or name tags, and broke a lot of missionaries' plaques. It wasn't just my friend's mission, but a couple of missions in Mexico had this happen to them. And this all happened before 2012 when my friend got there. But when this happened, they started sending home groups of missionaries when they found out.
So there's a lot to unpack with any of these stories, but I think one of the things we should notice is that these stories are always told about a time before the teller of the story was in the mission. It was about the time before, when the mission operated differently than it does now. Sometimes these apostate missionaries wear a bead necklace, with each bead representing a different sin or the number of sins they'd committed. Other times, there's a bead that they've sewn into their garments, so when a fellow apostate hugs them, he can feel it and recognize their comrade. Sometimes there's a book that includes their signatures.
Yeah, that last one I actually heard in the MTC that the elders stored this particular book in the ceiling. These stories sometimes, as we've already talked about, function as a warning to remind missionaries that no evil deed will go unseen. You'll remember in that last story that the transgressing missionaries were excommunicated. Well, here's another that seems to focus more on the act of cleaning house than it does on the missionaries' indiscretions.
I heard this story from a senior sister who was serving in South Africa at the time this happened. The senior sister told me that when President Holland visited their mission, he told them that their mission was doing much better, because the last time he had gone, she heard this from the other missionaries, he literally pointed at people and told them, "You're all going home."
Throw the rascals out.
And he just chose them. The mission president was super relieved because these were all the trouble missionaries, but it was a good chunk of the mission who was just sent home by Elder Holland.
So here is Holland just selecting, maybe based on the Spirit, which elders should go home. And here's another one that plays out that same idea.
My mission president actually told me this one, and he heard it from someone who was in the area presidency who was telling a story from when he was called as a mission president. So if that puts any veracity to the story. So he, the area president, was called as a mission president to Brasilia, and when he showed up, the mission president who was leaving said, "Look, we have a pretty big problem with the missionaries kind of breaking lots of rules, and we're pretty sure lots of commandments as well. You're going to want to look into that. I've tried to crack down, it hasn't helped, it's your go now." And so this mission president looks around and he decides to call everyone into one big meeting, and he tells everyone to pack their bags, come to this meeting. And everyone thinks it's just going to be like a transfer meeting. He goes through and he interviews over the course of 2 or 3 days every single one of the missionaries. And then he does this. He puts them into 3 columns. And so on the farthest column he says, "You guys are all going home. You've broken serious commandments, serious enough to get you sent home from your mission. So grab your bags, grab your suitcases, and leave now." And he says, "People in the middle, you guys have the option of staying if you want to or not. Your sins aren't too serious to where you would need to go home, but you can. If you don't repent, you should go home, but if you feel like you want to stay in your mission and repent, then you can stay." He says, "People on the left have no idea what I'm talking about. You're great." And so that's what he did. That's the story that my mission president was told by the Area 70 who lived this experience. I'm still pretty far removed, but it's the most truthful story I could tell. My mission president heard this at the mission president conference as things you have to watch out for with your missionaries, and secret combinations is one of them. And this story was one that the Area 70 ran into as a mission president. I can't really remember the details, but the missionaries had like a ranking system based on the commandments that you broke, whether it was just mission handbook or all the way to breaking one of the 10. They were all different things, but I can't remember how they verified it though. It was maybe colored beads that they sewed into their garments.
This act of cleansing here clearly echoes the scriptural imagery and vernacular usage of the parable found in Matthew 13, the sifting of the wheat and the tares. The other thing that I love about these stories, if you haven't already picked up on it, is that Elder Holland appears repeatedly. In one telling of this legend, Elder Holland is even referred to as Hurricane Holland, which I absolutely love. I think Holland's appearance in these stories seem to depict a popular framing of the general authority as the pulpit-pounding apostle.
I remember as a young missionary hearing about how visiting apostles would want to shake everyone's hands and look us each in the eye to discern our spiritual standing. I never experienced this, but I remember one elder telling me that he thought it would be the very worst to have to do this with Elder Holland. At the time I didn't understand why. I've always thought of Elder Holland as loving, if bold. But it was clear to me that if I wanted to bond with this elder, the right thing to do was to agree.
Elder Holland, if you're listening, know that we love you. And we find that an interesting generational turn is that in more recent accounts, Elder Bednar begins to appear as the apostle cleaning house.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
An interesting turn in folklore studies is advocacy scholarship, or what some have referred to as applied folklore. Historically, folklorists have been cautious to debunk legend. Rather, they've focused on taxonomy, cultural reception, analysis of stories.
However, when folklore is ugly, magnifying cultural injustices such as legends that reinforce classism, racism, or sexism, academics have, at times, deconstructed the lore to show how narrative cycles demonize or dehumanize certain populations. I'm thinking of Tom Old's book on the Welfare Queen or Wolfgang Meiter's research on Proverbs in Nazi Germany. Check it out. It's great research.
Yeah, that all makes sense of why we've had this turn. One of our favorite folklorists, perhaps Christine and my first folklore mentor, Jeannie Thomas, a professor at Utah State University, created a method for determining when a legend may not quite add up. A suggestion for when you need to raise your eyebrows and think, is this a authentic story? Is it passing on real information? For those of you on YouTube, you should be able to see the image on the screen, but for those who are just listening, Thomas refers to this as the SLAP test, and that's an acronym, SLAP.
All right, so let's break this down. Scare for S. Does the account attempt to scare? Logistics. L. Does it rely on complicated or far-fetched logistics? A list. Does it involve famous people, products, or events? And P. Prejudice. And does it demonize or portray a person or group as other? I think most of us can agree that these stories all fail the SLAP test. These stories attempt to keep missionaries in line. They highlight specific general authorities, Elder Holland, as we discussed. They take place all over the globe, include far-fetched details such as hanky-panky in the baptismal font, and they caution us against breaking the rules, creating a them-us mentality. And here's the thing. I think this is a profoundly excellent tool for approaching the friend of a friend narrative that we're talking about today.
It is. I still think a folklorist's job isn't to debunk, and I know you share my views on that, but to decipher the importance of legends. But that doesn't mean individuals shouldn't be wary about the stories they hear.
Ironically, sometimes these sensational stories can be true. Chris, tell us about the story related to the 1960s French mission. Some of you are going to be familiar with this.
Right. This actually happened in the late 1950s. We have a missionary, William Tucker, who has been reading tracts from a new fundamentalist church called the Church of the Firstborn of Fullness of Times, based in Mexico. And as he learns different teachings such as the Adam God doctrine, the current practice of plural marriage, and so forth, the authority claims, he began to teach it to his fellow missionaries, including probably the most problematic belief that the church was currently in apostasy. And he actually found probably a dozen fellow missionaries that were really open to that idea. And they respected William Tucker. Ultimately, a group of apostles and high leaders in the church actually came to the French mission and excommunicated this group. This is fully documented. You can read it in articles published in Dialogue. And a couple of these missionaries actually end up as apostles in this new church not too long after their excommunication, and they're being kicked off their mission.
So there it is. Sometimes the fantastic is true. And these stories, of course, should remind us that missionaries are just people. I think the 1.5 to 2 year sacrifice that these youngsters make is to be admired. I value the time I served, and I know that Chris does as well.
That's right.
And while I do believe God inspires and guides missionaries as they seek after revelation, we also know that missions can be demanding, that even when they are set apart and endowed, that they're still susceptible to the types of things that all 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are susceptible to.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Angels and Seer Stones. We'll be back very soon with an episode on stories of Jesus appearing in temples.
A different tone than this episode, for sure.
Yeah, I'd say so. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
We would like to thank our narrators, Jackson Washburn of Harvard Divinity School, Jeffrey Cannon of the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, and Katie Deal, Rachel Helps, and Trevin Hatch, all of Brigham Young University. Thanks, guys. We couldn't have done this episode without you.
Angels and Seer Stones is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network. You can support this podcast and others in our network by subscribing at dialoguejournal.com.